This video looks at planning. So in the previous videos we looked at initiating processes, but what we're going to look at today is in this video is the planning processes. So we've done the initiating processes. We've developed a high-level scope statement for a consultant or client work, or we've got a scope. We figured out the scope of the project, and we have authorization to proceed. So now we proceed with the planning, where we establish a detailed scope of work. We figure out exactly what we're going to be doing. We're going to refine the definition of the project objectives. What do we really want to do? So you'll have a high level idea, a sort of basic idea of what you want to do, but this is where you really hone in on it and you really come up with the detail of the whole thing. And then you figure out how are we going to achieve those objectives, how are we going to produce the deliverables. And it's an iterative process. An iterative process is you plan the whole thing, and then you go through and do it again to sort of refine it, and then you go through again. So you might go through a couple of iterations before you sort of arrive at a plan that's actually the best way to deliver the project. So the planning processes, I wish I'd spelled processes right, ask the following questions. Why? Why is the problem addressed by the project? Why is it being sponsored? Why is it being done? What is the work to be performed? What are the major deliverables? Who's going to be involved? Who's going to do what? When are they going to do it? How much finance is required? How much time is required? How will the project team communicate? How will the stakeholders be communicated with? How we get the project team? So those questions and more need to be answered in this process. So just looking at our objectives, project integration management is another one of those knowledge areas, and it's the processes required to ensure the various elements of the project are properly coordinated. So you can't plan the time in isolation. You can't just plan the time and say that's fine. You have to integrate the cost, because every time you change something involving time, it's going to affect cost. Every time you change the quality, it's going to affect the time, it's going to affect the cost, it's going to affect the scope. So those objectives, otherwise known as constraints, are all a balancing act. So you change one and it's going to affect the others. So project integration management is bringing all those things together and planning them all together. So the various elements are integrated. And there's also risk, procurement, human resources, communication, safety, environmental protection, stakeholder management. They are also part of that. But if I drew that in here, it would just be this complicated mess. So it's not just these four, it's also these ones here. So you've got all of those, 12 knowledge areas, and they all need to be integrated together into one cohesive plan. Now, another concept that you need to get is progressive elaboration. This is process of increasing the level of detail of the project plan. So what you're looking at here in the planning process, what's coming out at the end, is a project plan. This is how we're going to do the project. And it's not like you just sit down and start at the start and write it all down. It's an iterative process. So this picture here is quite good. So here's a progressive elaboration of a drawing of someone's arm. Okay, so they start off with a bit of a sketch, they put a little bit more detail in, so now you know where the elbow is, so you can detail the elbow, you can detail the shoulder, you can produce a little bit more detail on it, and then eventually you end up with a highly detailed picture of an arm. And it's the same with a project. You start off with a bit of a sketchy idea of how it's going to be, you add a little bit more detail, you understand it a bit better, a bit more detail, and then finally you come up with something that's pretty well detailed and sort of works. So that's quite an important concept. You don't have all the answers at the start of the planning process, but hopefully at the end you do have a pretty good idea of what you're going to be doing. So it is an iterative process. So for example, you start off with a project charter, you'll do an initial work breakdown structure, you figure out the resources, you'll do a rough schedule, so figure out the timing, you'll come up with a rough cost, and then you can have another look and say, well, we can't get all of these resources here that we would like, so we're going to have to revise the schedule. It's going to take us a little bit longer because we're not going to have all the resources we want, it's going to cost us a little bit more because we have to get external resources, and then you find out, well, these are the resources we've actually got, we can get, that we're going to commit to it, this is what it's actually going to take us, the time it's going to take us, and this is how much it's going to cost. So you can see that we're going through the schedule 3 times here, rough, revising a little bit more, then developing the final schedule. So those are known as planning loops or spirals, iterative planning, getting more and more detail as we go until we sort of arrive at the final plan. So also you need to be considering these enterprise environmental factors, and we looked at these in a previous slide, but just to remind you, these are the cultural, political, legal and physical conditions that affect the project's success. So there's the internal factors, there's the organization that you're working in, that the client's organization is as well, the structure, the resources you have within your organization, how your systems work, how you communicate, your lines of communication, your organizational structure, and your organization's tolerance for risk. And there's also external factors. There's the local conditions that you're working in, the economy and markets. Is the material that's specified or the material you want available within the market? Is it expensive? Can you get the resources? Can you procure additional services, like can you procure surveyors, or can you procure extra excavators, for example, for a reasonable price? There's industry standards if you're doing design. And also construction, there are New Zealand standards that tell you how you should be doing it. There's laws and regulations that you have to comply with, and community and politics. So these things all constrain what you can and you can't do as part of your project. So the project doesn't live a life all of its own. It's actually affected by these enterprise environmental factors, which we looked at before. What helps you is your organizational process assets. These are the policies, the plans, the guidelines, the templates, the knowledge bases, the things that your organization has within it. So you've probably done it before, you've probably done a project like this before, and so essentially it's that knowledge base. You know what worked in the last project, what didn't work, you know how long it took for an excavator to dig 300 cubic meters of soil, you knew what went wrong, what sort of communications worked and what didn't work, how much it cost you to run your labour, to run your plant. So you have that information, and also you have the organisational processes and procedures. So you've got guidelines and templates. So instead of coming up with a risk management plan all of your own, there's probably a template there and you sort of fill in the gaps. Standards and specifications, your organisation probably has how to do it. If you are putting down piles, here's the methodology that we use, and standard procedures, same thing, and communication channels within your organisation and with other organisations. So those organisational process assets help you in your planning of the project, and we looked at those in our previous videos. So develop the project management plan. So that's what you're looking at. This is what your project's going to be. You've got the project charter, which is sort of telling you, giving you a high level view of what's supposed to be done. You've got subsidiary plans, so there might be other things, say the council code of practice or things like that. You've got those enterprise environmental factors that we sort of talked about before, and the organisational process assets, and they all go into producing the project management plan. So there's expert judgment here, and that's where you define the scope, time, cost, quality, risk, procurement, human resources, communication, safety, environmental protection, and stakeholder management plans, all together in one project, and what that does, in one document. And that is basically the map. This is how we're going to carry out this project. Now it's not you don't just produce it and forget about it. You produce it, you're always referring to it, and you're always updating it as well. So let's look at where we're going with this whole course. So next session we're going to look at scope management, where we collect the requirements for the project, we define the scope, we figure out what needs to happen, we come up with a scope statement, and then we break that whole thing down into a work breakdown structure. Then we do the time planning, where we estimate the resources, figure out how long it's going to take us to do each one, we figure out the sequence of the whole thing, and then later on we sort of look at how we're going to get the resources, not just human resources, but also plant and equipment, and procurement, what do we need to obtain from outside of our organization, and also quality, what are the quality things required for each work package. So from here on we're actually working at work package level, and then it all comes together into one thing. So the quality for each work package, the communications, the safety, the environmental planning. Now we're not really looking at these in this course, we looked at them in construction practices. And then what happens there is you come up with the schedule, which is the program, timetable, whatever you want to call it, which has all of these things all sort of inputting into it. And once you've got that, once you've got the resources and stuff, you can start estimating the costs and the budget and then the cash flow. So what we're looking at there is all of this is your project plan. This is how we're going to do the project. This is how we're going to resource it. This is how we're going to procure stuff. This is what it's going to cost. This is how we're going to make sure it's done properly. This is how we're going to make sure that we're communicating with people properly. This is how we're going to do it safely. This is how we're going to do it to protect the environment, and this is the timing that we're going to do it all on. And so the project management plan is quite an important document, and as I said, this is what you'll be doing as part of your project. So it sets out how the project will be executed, monitored and controlled. It documents the assumptions, decisions. It with the project management plan, it is a document that you can give to the project sponsor or to your boss, and they can look at it and they can say, yes, that's okay, that's the way I want you to implement it, or I'm not quite happy with the way you're doing this, I'd rather you did it this way. So it's also approved by the project management organization, the client, the project sponsor, all those sort of people there. It allows them to see what you're going to do and to have some input into it, and then finally approve it and say, yes, we're okay with the way that you are proposing to manage this project. And so that's quite an important step, and it's quite an important document.